All right, it is time to talk about a Shannon Reads Those Books book with Moby-Dick. Yes, I made it through. I finally finished Moby-Dick. Yay! All right, let's get into the information about this book. So it's called Moby-Dick, but it is also called Moby-Dick or the Whale. My edition is just called Moby-Dick with a hyphen. Sometimes I can't find it on my spreadsheet because I forget there's a hyphen. It's by Herman Melville. Was published in 1851, and it makes my Shannon Reads Those Books list for being on two different lists. One is the Book Riot 0 to Well Read list, which I think is one of the lists I'm having the most success with. It's also number 161 on the BBC Big Read, but I'm surprised it's not on the Modern Library list. I thought that was an American list, and this is like sort of like a great American novel, and it is. So I was surprised it wasn't on that list. So, but hey, it's on two lists. I read it. It is the 47th title that I have read for the Shannon Reads Those Books exploration, which I started back in 2014. The goal of which was to increase my reading comprehension and read books that are influential, highly referenced, zeitgeist, just stuff that influences and is a part of pop culture. And oh boy, is this a book that is part of pop culture. This is definitely one of the books that I feel like a lot of people like. It just reference a lot whether they've read it or not, and I'm probably I do. Like the themes of it seem to come up again and again and again, regardless of whether someone's read the book. So it was definitely high on my list to read for that, because I do like reading books that are referenced again and again. And the reason why I chose it right now is that I'm trying to work through books that are the oldest on my Goodreads TBR, books that I added the day I joined Goodreads back in 2010. I'm trying to finish them by next February. I joined in February 2010. So I was looking for this one very specifically, and it was either, I unwrapped it, and so I had to choose between these three to try and figure out which was Moby Dick. And like honestly, like look at how similar, like especially these two, like I could easily unwrap something else. I'm not quite sure exactly what these are. I know what the two books are, but I don't know which is which. Anyway, so yeah, so I finally got to reading it, and it took me a while. It took me a little longer than I had hoped. I ended up reading it between May and June 2019, and it took I think about 6 weeks. I knew it was like pushing it to try and finish it in a month, because this copy is 655 pages as a trade paperback, and I think usually it comes in more like 800 pages, but I did finish it. Oh, I didn't finish everything on this card though. So this falls under the genres of adventure, which I would definitely agree with, epic, which I guess so, and also Wikipedia lists it as an encyclopedic novel, which is the most accurate genre, I would say. It is definitely an encyclopedic novel. It is a bit of a weird blend of fiction with the story, and then nonfiction about whales, whaling, the sea, like, creatures in the sea. There's lots of information on that. If you're interested in information on creatures of the sea and what you can do with them, this book not, did not really work for me for that rating, for that, in that sense. Anyway, so I ended up giving this a 7.5 out of 10, and I rated it 3 stars on Goodreads. It's one of the weird ones where it falls under, like, I didn't super enjoy reading it. There were definitely moments, like some of the writing is gorgeous. It has a great start, has a great end, and has really long sentences. Like it really feels like you're sitting around a campfire and someone's telling you a tale. But it feels like you would be doing that for like every night for an entire year to get through all of the tale. And I did like the narrative. But I didn't really enjoy all of the stuff about whaling. Now, I should preface this because I did read In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex? The Tragedy of the Essex, which was turned into the movie In the Heart of the Sea. And that is a nonfiction account of the story that inspired Moby Dick. So I was going into this having a pretty strong sense of the narrative. And that book also talks a lot about whaling in terms of the technical, like what you do with the whale. And this goes into that a lot. So, I would strongly not recommend this for anyone who is like very, feel strongly about animals, and how animals are treated. There was a lot of disturbing and upsetting stuff in terms of that kind of stuff. It wasn't done viciously. Like, this was written 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. So lots has changed, and but it's still very unnerving to think of, an animal as a resource in the way in which they did, and they certainly didn't think that they were, like, they thought it was a resource that was sustainable, like not even sustainable, but like could not be like, they didn't think that they were having an impact. They thought it was, what's that word where it's like a button, more than abundant, like no way you could run out of whales to catch. So anyway, all of that stuff I found rather upsetting. But the narrative itself is quite compelling, and I did like the stories, and I did like the characters. And if you had just pulled out all of the narrative pieces, all of the plot points, and taken away all of the information about whaling and whales, I would have enjoyed this so much more. And like, there are like entire chapters that are based on how you deal with the whale, and it's really like specific and just too much. So, but of course, this was made before the internet. So if someone wanted that information and was curious about that information, it's not like you could just get it, and when people went whaling, it was for years usually. So it's not like anyway. So all of that was really challenging, but the narrative itself I thought was quite compelling, but it also was different than I expected. So I've totally gone off course on my questions here. So why did I choose it? We've covered that. It was the oldest on my Goodreads TBR. One of the questions I always ask myself is, did I understand it? And with this one, I have to come down on sort of, or mostly. And that is because the language is a bit more challenging. I initially started reading this at night, but I had to switch to reading it during the daytime when I was more awake and more alert. But even then, I felt like I wasn't getting all of it, and I was disinterested in all the whaling stuff, so that didn't help. But it was easy to tell when they're talking about the crew, what's happening, and the whales, and the ship, and all that stuff, versus when they're talking about like what you do with a whale. But when they were but there was, and when they finally, sometimes got back to actually what was going on with the crew, I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I don't even remember who the crew members are. Like, I don't remember what the different dynamic is. Like, some of them, like Ishmael, who is the narrator slash sort of protagonist, and his good friend Queg, and Ahab, who's the captain. That was clear, but sort of like everyone else, I wasn't quite sure. One thing that was awesome, and I don't know if this is the first time the name is ever used, thought it was super cool that there's a character in this named Starbuck. So like, that was super awesome. But Starbuck was the one that I kept on being like, I'm not sure what's going on with Starbuck. Like, I couldn't remember what Starbuck's, like, where his loyalties lay, because of course a big part of the story, and the what people reference from this book is Ahab's very direct and singular focus on catching and killing Moby-Dick, which is a huge whale, like a huge white whale, grander than any other whale ever seen ever. Yeah, so that's what people, that's how people reference it. But in terms of like the fact, was this what I expected? I would say no, because that story is such a small part. Like, in terms of like the impact of it, yeah, it's strong. Ahab is very, singularly focused. But like, Ahab, I felt, was barely in it. And so there's all this other stuff going on, and and I feel like and Ishmael's the protagonist, so it's not even really about Ahab. So I'm just like, I'm not really understanding this. So this, I would have to say, one of the weirdest things with this book and reading this book, one of the weirdest experiences, this is one book that I think maybe is most likely, it's the first time I've read something from the those books list that I think people might say they've read it, but they haven't, because it, or maybe they just enjoy all the stuff about whaling. Because it's just like that is not, there's so much in it that isn't about that main plot line. Like that main plot is so minuscule in comparison to like all of the things that happen and even who the protagonist is. And so that I found real. That was the first. That was a first. The first time I felt like maybe people, when they say they've read this book, actually haven't, or they've, they know. I think, or I think maybe a better way to say, because I'm not saying people are liars. Maybe a better way to say this is that this is one book that I think people know the story from pop culture as opposed to know the story from reading the book. That's clearer, I think, and that's more true. Um, I don't think people generally lie about the books they read. I don't. There's one of the book tags. That's one of the questions, and everyone's like, no, or not intentionally, or maybe just nobody wants to admit it. I don't know. Anyway, so that's the one thing I think I learned with this one was that it feels like the pop culture, impression of this book is not really the what it's about. But on the other hand, is that the strongest thread in terms of the narrative? I guess so, but I don't know. But it's funny. I also did read some other works. In after this, I did read the Classics Illustrated comic for this, and I enjoyed that. And it very much follows the narrative. So I got that story, a nice 50 pages worth of Classics Illustrated. Thank you, Hoopla. So that was awesome. And there is a graphic novel adaptation that came out in the past several years that I also plan on reading. I should have reviewed this after I read that, but oh well. So yeah, so this was not a huge win for me. I did not really enjoy it. I did feel like I don't know, it's like I would even, and one of the weird things about this one is I would reread it and then skip everything that was sort of the encyclopedic stuff and then just read the narrative because that's the part that I found compelling, and because I found all of the other stuff just disturbing. I did find it disturbing. This, I'm not gonna lie, all of the stuff about whaling was really, really disturbing. So it makes me wonder because I feel like I'm someone who would enjoy nautical stories, but I have not had much luck with that. And maybe I need to pick one that is not about um, capturing creatures, perhaps, because I'm like, leave that creature alone. But they did also, like, there was quite a reverence for a lot of things, but there was also, like, you know, dollar signs in the eyeballs. Like, this is like, oh my gosh, we're going to get a lot from this one, kind of stuff. So, it's not, it is a for-profit enterprise. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say. One of the other questions I have for myself is, will I read more from this author? And to be honest, I don't know if there is, like, this is the one that he is known for, as far as I know. But as I already said, I would reread it just for the narrative part. And the last question I have is, am I glad that I read it? And I would say yes, because it is so referenced. And now, like, it's so funny because now I do feel proud that I did make it all the way through. I'm not going to lie, I do like picking some books that are challenges, and I do feel strongly, I do feel like happy that I was able to finish it. And there was enough interesting in it that made it worth it. Although I will say I was extremely uncomfortable, not just with the whaling, but also with how Ishmael talks about someone that he befriends, and because he interchangeably calls him a pagan, a savage, and a cannibal, like interchangeably, like as if those things mean the same thing. And I don't feel comfortable with that at all. I don't feel comfortable with some, like with savage. I'm like, is that even? Would you even like? Yes, this was written 158 years ago, so or 7 years ago. So there's that, or more, 1767, I think, years ago. So there is like, I understand that, but also it's like someone who's a pagan isn't necessarily a cannibal. Like, that's a huge leap. And I also was never sure if that was true. Of the character he was referring to. So that was very uncomfortable, and that comes up again and again and again. But he does befriend him, so that's actually one of the things I liked most was their friendship in the story. Like it, I don't know. So let me know. Have you read Moby-Dick? Have you made it all the way through? Did you find it worth it? And or do you just, get the pop culture version of it? I know for me, my strongest pop culture reference for this is in Star Trek First Contact. And it has to do with Captain Picard, and I can't remember the character's name. It's Alfred Woodard's character, and it's a great moment in Star Trek First Contact. So that is my strongest reference to Moby Dick. I guess now my strongest reference is actually reading this. So, but I am going to try the graphic novel, so maybe I will enjoy that more. So there is my very, very long, rambly talk about Moby Dick. I don't know what I'm going to pick next from the Shannon Reads Those Books list. I haven't been doing awesome on it this year. That being said, I only set myself to read 6 books, and I've read 2 or 3, so I'm not doing too bad. But I don't know what I'll pick next. Only time will tell. Okay, thank you so much for watching.